"Get out, and don't ever come back," Patricia Collins said, and the sound of the front door locking behind 15-year-old Eleanor Whitman was louder than the thunder rolling across the Ohio sky. The rain came down in sharp, slanted sheets, soaking through Eleanor's thin sweater in seconds as she stood on the small concrete porch of the only home she had ever known, her sneakers already filling with cold water, while wind pushed against her like an invisible wall determined to move her off that step and into a world she was not prepared to face. Inside, through the narrow window beside the door, she could see the warm yellow glow of the kitchen light and the shadow of Patricia moving past it without hesitation, without turning back, as if the girl outside were nothing more than a delivery left in the wrong place. The accusation had come less than an hour earlier, sudden and sharp. A missing envelope of cash from Patricia's bedroom dresser, money meant to cover a late mortgage payment. And when Eleanor had tried to explain that she had never even stepped into that room, her words were cut short by a look that carried more final judgment than any courtroom. Patricia had already decided, and once Patricia decided something, the truth no longer mattered. Eleanor had always known she wasn't Patricia's daughter by blood, a quiet fact that lingered at the edges of every holiday dinner and every strained smile. But she had believed that years under the same roof counted for something, that shared breakfasts and school pickups and the small rituals of daily life built a kind of unspoken loyalty. That belief dissolved the moment Patricia pointed toward the door and said, "I won't be stolen from in my own house." Now, with only $12 crumpled in her jeans pocket and a backpack holding a change of clothes and her geometry textbook, Eleanor stepped off the porch and into the storm. The gravel driveway slicked beneath her feet as lightning briefly lit up the bare maple trees lining the yard. She did not scream, she did not pound on the door, and she did not beg, because somewhere beneath the shock rising in her chest was a quiet, steady realization that no one inside that house was coming to open the door again. She walked the half-mile to the bus stop. At the edge of Route 36, her hair plastered to her cheeks, passing darkened houses where families were likely gathered around televisions and dinner tables, unaware that a girl their children's age was learning, in real time, what it felt like to be erased. Each step carried her farther from the only address she had ever memorized and closer to a future she could not yet picture. But even as her hands trembled from the cold, something inside her settled into place, a thin but unbreakable line of resolve forming where fear might have taken over. Patricia believed she was throwing away a problem, a burden she no longer wished to manage. But as Eleanor sat alone on the metal bench beneath the flickering streetlight, watching headlights blur past on the rain-soaked highway, she made a silent promise that the word "out" would not be the end of her story, only the beginning of a distance so vast that one day, when doors opened again, it would not be Eleanor standing outside in the storm. The rain did not stop for another hour, and by the time the last rumble of thunder faded into the distance, Eleanor Whitman understood that waiting for someone to change their mind was a luxury she could not afford. The metal bench at the bus stop was slick and freezing beneath her, and the single streetlight above her flickered as if unsure whether to stay on or surrender to the storm. But she kept her spine straight and her eyes fixed on the highway, counting each passing car as proof that the world was still moving forward even if her own life had just been pushed off course. When the late evening bus finally arrived, its brakes hissing as it pulled to the curb, the driver glanced at her soaked clothes and small backpack and asked where she was headed, and for a brief second she realized she had nowhere specific to name. She chose downtown Columbus because it was the only place she had heard adults describe as full of opportunity, and she handed over part of her $12 with steady fingers, stepping into the warmth of the bus without looking back toward the dark stretch of road that led home. The ride lasted nearly 40 minutes, long enough for her breathing to slow and for the initial shock to settle into something colder and more focused, and as storefront lights replaced cornfields outside the window, she made a quiet inventory of what she had left. One extra pair of jeans, a toothbrush, a geometry textbook, and a determination that felt far older than 15 years. She did not call any friends because she did not want to explain what had happened, and she did not reach out to distant relatives because she already knew how the story would sound once it traveled back through Patricia's version of events. Instead, she stepped off the bus into streets that smelled faintly of wet pavement and coffee from a nearby diner. realizing that survival would depend less on fairness and more on her willingness to adapt. That first night, she found a 24-hour laundromat with bright fluorescent lights and a row of plastic chairs against the wall, and she sat there pretending to wait for clothes that did not exist, drying her hair under the warm air vent, and studying the faces of strangers who came and went without noticing her. She felt invisible. But invisibility also meant freedom from questions, and for the first time since the door had closed behind her, she felt something close to control. As the hours passed and the sky shifted from black to a muted gray, Eleanor made a decision that would quietly shape the rest of her life. She would not spend her energy proving she was innocent to someone who had already decided she was guilty, and she would not let the lie define her future. Instead, she would build something so steady and so undeniable that no accusation could ever shake it again. When morning traffic began to hum outside and the city fully woke, Eleanor Whitman stood up from that plastic chair, adjusted the straps on her backpack, and stepped into the new day not as a girl waiting to be taken back, but as someone who understood that from this point forward, every door she walked through would be one she opened herself. By the end of that first week in Columbus, Eleanor Whitman understood that independence did not arrive as a grand moment of triumph, but as a series of small, disciplined choices made when no one was watching. She found a bulletin board inside a neighborhood grocery store advertising part-time help, and although she was only 15, she told the store manager the truth about her age and her situation without embellishment, her voice steady and respectful, and something in her calm honesty persuaded him to give her a trial shift stocking shelves after school hours in exchange for cash at the end of each night. She enrolled in the local public high school using the address of a temporary youth housing program she had located through a community center, and while the room she was assigned held only a narrow twin bed, a metal locker, and a shared bathroom down the hall, it offered something more valuable than comfort, which was stability. Each morning she woke before 6 o'clock, folded her blanket with careful precision, and reviewed her algebra notes while the rest of the building stirred awake around her. She did not speak about her past to classmates, and she did not correct rumors when someone guessed she had simply moved from another district, because she had already learned that explanations often invited judgment rather than understanding. Instead, she focused on measurable progress, on report cards, on pay envelopes, on the simple mathematics of saving $5 whenever she could, even when it meant skipping small luxuries like a soda after work. Months passed, and the seasons shifted from the sharp chill of early spring to the heavy heat of summer, and with each paycheck Eleanor placed a portion into a basic savings account that the bank clerk helped her open, studying the monthly statements as if they were proof that her life was no longer spiraling, but building, number by number. She began preparing for the General Educational Development exam, reasoning that finishing high school early would allow her to work more hours and reduce her dependence on temporary housing. And every evening she sat at a scratched wooden desk in the corner of the community center, practicing essay responses and math problems, while other teenagers talked about weekend plans she could not afford to consider. She did not resent them, because resentment consumed energy she needed for something else, something larger and quieter. Occasionally, in unguarded moments, she thought about Patricia Collins and the house on Route 36, wondering whether the missing money had ever been found or whether the story of her guilt had simply hardened into family legend. But those thoughts no longer burned the way they once had. They felt distant, like thunder heard miles away. What mattered was that she was no longer waiting for someone to clear her name or invite her back. And as her 16th birthday approached, marked not by candles, but by a longer work schedule and a higher savings balance, Eleanor realized that the storm that had once seemed like the end of her world had instead stripped away every illusion she had about security being something given by others. Security, she was learning, was something constructed slowly, deliberately, and often alone, and she was already laying the foundation. At 17, Eleanor Whitman no longer measured time by birthdays, but by milestones that proved she was moving forward. The day her General Educational Development results arrived in the mail, she opened the envelope at the same scratched wooden desk inside the community center where she had spent countless evenings studying, and when she saw that she had passed every section on her first attempt, she allowed herself exactly one deep breath of satisfaction before folding the paper carefully and placing it inside her backpack as if it were a contract with her future. With her certification completed a year early, she increased her hours at the grocery store to nearly 40 hours a week, often arriving before sunrise to unload delivery trucks and leaving after sunset with sore feet and a quiet sense of pride that came from earning every dollar honestly. She tracked her income in a small spiral notebook, listing rent contributions to the housing program, bus fare, groceries, and the steady deposits into her savings account, watching the balance climb past $1,000 for the first time and realizing that financial stability was not an abstract dream, but a visible, growing number. During her breaks, she read books about personal finance and small business management borrowed from the public library, intrigued by the idea that property ownership created security in a way that no single paycheck ever could. And although she had never stepped inside a bank beyond opening her basic account, she began imagining a life where she understood mortgages, interest rates, and investment strategies better than anyone who had ever doubted her. By 18, she had secured a small rented room in a modest brick duplex on the east side of the city, signing her first lease with steady handwriting and feeling a quiet triumph in knowing that her name alone stood on the agreement. The room measured barely 10 by 12 feet, but it was hers, paid for with money she had earned, and every time she turned the key in the door, she felt the subtle but powerful shift from surviving to building. She enrolled in community college part-time, choosing courses in accounting and business law, sitting in classrooms with students of all ages and backgrounds while taking detailed notes, as if each lecture contained instructions for constructing the life she intended to lead. She did not speak often, but when professors asked questions about budgeting or asset management, her answers were precise, shaped by lived experience rather than theory. Occasionally, late at night, when the city quieted and the hum of traffic faded outside her window, memories of Route 36 surfaced without warning, yet they no longer carried the same sting. Patricia Collins had become less a figure of anger and more a distant symbol of a closed chapter, someone who had pushed her out without realizing she had also pushed her toward a discipline and focus that few of her peers possessed. Eleanor did not fantasize about revenge, and she did not rehearse speeches for a future confrontation. Instead, she concentrated on acquiring knowledge, credentials, and capital, believing that true power was not loud or dramatic, but structured and patient. By the time she turned 19, her savings had grown steadily, her grades were strong, and the girl who once sat alone under a flickering streetlight now walked through bank lobbies and college hallways with the calm confidence of someone who understood that her trajectory was no longer defined by a single night in a storm, but by the deliberate, unwavering choices she made every day thereafter. By the time Eleanor Whitman turned 22, the careful discipline that had once been a survival strategy had become her defining trait, shaping not only how she earned money, but how she saw opportunity where others saw risk. After completing her associate degree in accounting, she accepted a full-time position at a small property management firm in downtown Columbus, a modest office on the third floor of an aging brick building where she was responsible for tracking rental payments, maintenance expenses, and profit margins across several apartment complexes scattered throughout the city. She paid attention to patterns that others overlooked, noticing which neighborhoods were slowly improving, which properties were undervalued, and how minor renovations could significantly increase long-term returns. And instead of spending her income on status symbols, she continued living in her small duplex room for another year, channeling nearly half of every paycheck into savings and a carefully researched investment account. At 24, with a credit score she had built meticulously and a savings balance that once would have seemed impossible, she met with a loan officer at a local bank to discuss purchasing her first property, a modest two-bedroom foreclosure listed well below market value on the south side of the city. She arrived at the meeting prepared with spreadsheets, projected rental income estimates, and a calm confidence that surprised even the loan officer, who approved her for a conservative mortgage based on her steady employment and disciplined financial history. Signing those closing documents felt different from signing her first lease years earlier, because this time she was not simply securing shelter, but acquiring an asset, something that would appreciate over time and generate income rather than consume it. She spent weekends painting walls in neutral tones, replacing worn fixtures, and cleaning every inch of the small house herself to reduce renovation costs. Moving into one bedroom, while renting out the second to a graduate student, whose monthly payment covered most of the mortgage. Within 18 months, property values in the neighborhood had risen, and Eleanor refinanced at a lower interest rate, freeing additional capital to consider a second purchase. The process repeated itself with steady precision, never rushed and never reckless. And by the time she reached her early 30s, she owned 3 modest rental properties, each selected for long-term growth rather than short-term appearance. Each managed with the same attention to detail she once applied to balancing grocery store inventory. She rarely spoke about her portfolio to friends or co-workers, preferring privacy over praise. Yet internally, she recognized the significance of what she had built, a foundation of tangible assets that no accusation or sudden dismissal could ever strip away. On quiet evenings, as she reviewed rental agreements at her kitchen table, she occasionally thought about the house on Route 36, not with anger, but with a detached clarity that allowed her to see the larger arc of her life. The night she had been told to leave had forced her to learn financial literacy, resilience, and strategic patience far earlier than most people her age. And although she would never have chosen that path willingly, she could not deny that it had carved in her a capacity for independence that now translated into measurable, growing wealth. Eleanor no longer felt like a displaced teenager seeking stability, because stability had become something she created deliberately, property by property, decision by decision, until the girl who once carried $12 in her pocket was now carrying keys to doors that represented security, leverage, and a future entirely of her own design. By the time Eleanor Whitman reached her late 30s, her life no longer revolved around proving that she could survive, but around deciding how far she intended to go. What had begun as a single foreclosure on the south side of Columbus had grown into a small, but carefully structured portfolio of 7 rental properties spread across 3 steadily improving neighborhoods, each one selected after thorough market analysis and conservative financial projections that left little room for unnecessary risk. She had left her position at the property management firm years earlier to establish her own limited liability company, choosing a simple name that carried her initials rather than anything flashy. And from a modest office suite overlooking a busy intersection, she oversaw leases, renovations, and long-term investment strategies with the same calm focus that once carried her through late-night study sessions at the community center. Her days were filled with practical decisions rather than emotional reactions, reviewing contractor bids, negotiating interest rates, and meeting with tenants to ensure maintenance issues were handled promptly. And although her schedule was demanding, she preferred the weight of responsibility to the helplessness she had once felt as a teenager standing in the rain. Financially, she had reached a level of stability that would have seemed unimaginable at 15, with multiple streams of rental income, a diversified investment account, and a credit profile strong enough to secure favorable financing whenever opportunity aligned with her criteria. Yet she continued to live well below her means, driving a reliable sedan rather than a luxury vehicle and reinvesting profits into strategic acquisitions rather than outward displays of success. It was during a routine review of county property listings one quiet afternoon that a familiar address caught her attention, a small house on Route 36 listed as part of a pending estate adjustment after years of deferred maintenance and unpaid property taxes. The street name alone was enough to still her hand on the mouse, because she recognized it immediately even after more than 2 decades. The listing described peeling exterior paint, outdated plumbing, and a roof nearing the end of its lifespan, and the asking price reflected both the condition and the urgency of the sale. Yet Eleanor did not react with anger or satisfaction. Instead, she studied the numbers, comparing recent comparable sales in the area, calculating renovation costs, projecting potential resale value with the detached precision of an experienced investor. She knew without checking that Patricia Collins would now be well into her 60s, perhaps facing financial strain after years of choices made without long-term planning. And although Eleanor had not seen or spoken to her since the night she left, the possibility of crossing paths again no longer stirred fear or resentment, but something quieter and more measured. She leaned back in her office chair and considered the opportunity in front of her, aware that life rarely offers symmetrical moments, yet sometimes circles back in unexpected ways. And as she reviewed the listing details once more, she recognized that this was not about reclaiming a past or proving a point. It was about whether the house that had once expelled her would now become just another line item in a portfolio built on patience, discipline, and the steady refusal to be defined by someone else's decision. The decision was not made out of nostalgia, and it was not made out of resentment. Eleanor Whitman approached the property on Route 36 the same way she approached every potential acquisition, with data, restraint, and a clear understanding of long-term value. And within 48 hours she had instructed her attorney to submit a formal offer slightly below the asking price, justified by documented repair estimates and recent comparable sales in the area. The response came quickly, not from Patricia Collins directly, but from a legal representative handling overdue taxes and outstanding liens, and the urgency in the paperwork confirmed what Eleanor had already calculated. The house was no longer a symbol of stability, but a financial burden that had been mismanaged for years. She drove out to the property on a gray Tuesday morning to conduct her own inspection, parking her sedan along the same stretch of gravel driveway where she once stood uncertain of her future, and as she stepped out of the car, she took in the visible signs of neglect, warped siding, an overgrown lawn, and a sagging section of gutter that dripped steadily from recent rain. There was no dramatic rush of memory, only a measured awareness of distance, as though she were observing someone else's childhood home rather than her own. She walked the perimeter with a contractor, discussing roof replacement costs and plumbing updates in practical terms, making notes on her tablet, evaluating square footage and structural integrity rather than emotional history. Inside, the air carried the stale scent of a house that had not been properly maintained, and although furniture still occupied the living room, it appeared worn and outdated, reflecting years of deferred upgrades that often accompany financial strain. Eleanor listened carefully as the contractor outlined necessary repairs, calculating renovation expenses against projected resale value, her mind operating with disciplined clarity. She did not ask about Patricia, and no one volunteered information. Yet as she stood in the narrow hallway near what had once been her bedroom, she understood that time had shifted the balance of power in ways neither of them could have predicted. Later that afternoon, her attorney called to confirm that her offer had been accepted pending final paperwork, and the closing date was scheduled within 30 days to expedite settlement of outstanding debts. Eleanor thanked him calmly and instructed her accountant to allocate funds from a designated acquisition account, ensuring the purchase would not disrupt her broader investment strategy. That evening, seated at her kitchen table reviewing the contract terms, she paused briefly over the property address printed at the top of the page, recognizing the quiet symmetry of the moment without dramatizing it. She was not reclaiming a lost past, and she was not seeking confrontation, but she was undeniably stepping into a position of ownership that transformed the meaning of that house entirely. For Patricia Collins, the sale likely represented necessity and surrender, yet for Eleanor it was simply another calculated step in a portfolio built over decades of steady discipline, and as she signed the documents with precise, unhurried strokes, she understood that the door once closed to her had not limited her path, but had ultimately expanded it beyond anything that house had ever been capable of containing. Closing day arrived, with none of the drama that might have once accompanied that address, and Eleanor Whitman walked into the title company office in downtown Columbus dressed in a tailored navy blazer, carrying a leather portfolio that held neatly organized documents rather than uncertainty. The conference room was small and brightly lit, with a polished wooden table and a stack of papers arranged beside a waiting pen. And across from her sat Patricia Collins, noticeably older, her posture slightly stooped, her once sharp expression softened by years that had not been particularly kind. For a brief moment their eyes met, and recognition flickered slowly across Patricia's face, followed by a tightening around her mouth that suggested both surprise and discomfort. Yet Eleanor did not look away or offer any dramatic acknowledgement. She simply took her seat, greeted the attorney with calm professionalism, and reviewed the settlement statement line by line, as she always did. The numbers were clear: outstanding property taxes, accumulated penalties, remaining mortgage balance, and the net amount that would be disbursed after closing costs. And as the attorney explained each figure in measured tones, Eleanor felt no surge of triumph, only the steady awareness that she was participating in a transaction built entirely on legal and financial reality. Patricia cleared her throat once, as if preparing to speak, but hesitated, perhaps uncertain whether to address Eleanor as a former child, a stranger, or now the buyer of her home. Finally, she said quietly that she had not expected to see her there, that life had been complicated, that misunderstandings had happened years ago, and her voice trailed off without fully forming an apology. Eleanor listened without interruption, her hands folded lightly on the table, and when she responded her tone was even and controlled as she stated that the past had already shaped both of their paths, and that today was simply about completing the paperwork. There was no accusation in her voice and no bitterness, only a boundary that required no explanation. One by one, signatures were placed where indicated, initials added beside paragraphs outlining transfer of ownership, and within less than an hour the house on Route 36 legally changed hands, its future no longer tied to sentiment or unresolved history, but to renovation plans, updated permits, and a projected increase in market value. When the final document was notarized, the attorney shook both of their hands, and Patricia lingered a moment as if searching for words that would alter the symmetry of the situation, yet Eleanor had already gathered her portfolio and stood to leave. She paused briefly, meeting Patricia's gaze with composed clarity, and said that she hoped she would find a stable place to live moving forward, because everyone deserved security, but security required choices made early and consistently. Then she walked out into the afternoon light, the signed deed secured in her folder, aware that the balance of power had shifted not through confrontation or raised voices, but through years of disciplined action that had quietly rewritten the meaning of a single command spoken long ago. Renovation began the following week with the same structured efficiency that had defined every other step of Eleanor Whitman's journey. Contractors arriving at 8 o'clock sharp to replace the aging roof, update outdated wiring, and install energy-efficient windows that would reduce long-term utility costs. She walked through the house each morning with a clipboard in hand, reviewing timelines and material invoices, discussing neutral paint selections and durable flooring options designed to increase both resale value and rental appeal. The narrow hallway that once felt like a corridor of judgment was widened visually with lighter colors and improved lighting. The small bedroom where she had once packed a backpack transformed into a bright, functional space with new trim and modern fixtures. And as the property steadily improved, it lost the heaviness of its past and began to reflect something entirely different: intention rather than impulse, planning rather than reaction. Within 3 months, the house was appraised at a value significantly higher than her total investment, and after reviewing current market conditions, Eleanor chose to list it for sale rather than hold it as a rental, calculating that the profit could be leveraged into 2 smaller multi-unit properties in stronger growth areas. The open house attracted several interested buyers, drawn by the updated features and competitive pricing, and when a young couple submitted a solid offer slightly above asking price, she accepted without hesitation, recognizing in their hopeful expressions the same desire for stability that had once driven her. On closing day, as she signed the final transfer documents, the profit margin confirmed what years of discipline had already proven. The house on Route 36 had become not a symbol of rejection but a catalyst for expansion, its equity now redirected into assets that would continue compounding long into the future. That evening, seated in her quiet home office overlooking the city skyline, Eleanor reviewed the wire confirmation showing the proceeds deposited into her business account, and instead of celebrating loudly, she opened her financial planning spreadsheet and allocated funds toward the next acquisitions, maintaining the steady rhythm that had carried her from $12 in her pocket to a diversified portfolio built on strategy rather than sentiment. She did not contact Patricia Collins, and she did not revisit the street again, because the transaction had already said everything that needed to be said. The power dynamic had shifted not through confrontation, but through time, education, and unwavering consistency. Years earlier, a door had closed with the intention of diminishing her future, yet that single moment had forced her to discover capacities she might never have explored otherwise. And now, as she looked out at the city lights stretching beyond her window, she understood that security was never about a single house or a single relationship, but about the quiet decisions repeated day after day when no one was applauding. The storm that once marked her exit had long since passed, replaced by a horizon she had built deliberately, And in the silence of that evening there was no anger left. Only the calm certainty that the path she walked had been shaped not by the words that expelled her, but by the choices she made after she stepped beyond the door.